I'm Sarah Mitchell, and I'm standing in the Hamilton County Family Court holding a manila folder that contains 12 years of my sister Jessica's lies. The judge just asked if I have evidence to support my claims about my parents' business, and across from me, my mother won't even look in my direction. My father sits rigid, his jaw clenched, while Jessica smirks like she's already won. Behind me, my two kids, Emma and Lucas, grip their school backpacks, their faces pale with confusion. We're here because my parents decided that my sister's third wedding was more important than helping me survive my divorce. They chose her champagne wishes over my children's basic needs. But what they don't know is that I've been gathering proof of Jessica's real pattern, and today, everything comes to light. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. The whole nightmare started 8 months ago when I discovered my husband, Mark, had been cheating with his secretary for 2 years. I came home early from Lincoln Elementary, where I teach 4th grade, planning to surprise him with his favorite dinner. Instead, I found text messages on his phone that made my stomach drop to the floor. Messages about weekend getaways while I thought he was working overtime, photos that weren't meant for a wife's eyes, plans for a future that didn't include me or our children. That evening, after Mark stumbled through pathetic excuses and hollow apologies, I called my parents. My hands shook as I dialed their number, tears streaming down my face while Emma and Lucas slept upstairs, oblivious to how their world was about to shatter. Dad answered on the third ring, his voice warm, like always, until he heard me sobbing. "Mom, Dad, I need to come over," I managed through my tears. "Mark's been cheating. I found everything. I need help figuring out what to do." There was silence on the other end, then my father's heavy sigh. "Of course, sweetheart. Come right over. We'll figure this out together." I thought that meant something. I thought family meant showing up when everything falls apart. I drove to their house on Oakwood Drive, the same house where Jessica and I grew up, where we carved our names in the oak tree out back, where we promised each other we'd always be sisters no matter what. The porch light was on, and I could see them through the kitchen window, probably making tea like Mom always did during family crises. But when I walked through that familiar front door, everything felt different. Jessica was there, sitting at the kitchen table with wedding magazines spread everywhere, her engagement ring catching the overhead light like a disco ball. She looked up at me with this expression of mild annoyance, like I was interrupting something important. "Oh, Sarah," she said, not getting up to hug me. "That's awful, but we're kind of in the middle of planning stuff here. Can this wait until tomorrow?" I stared at her, then at my parents, waiting for them to tell her how inappropriate that was. Instead, my mother started gathering the magazines. "Jessica's right, honey," Mom said, her voice strained. "We've got the caterer coming tomorrow morning and the florist after that. Your father and I have been up since dawn dealing with vendor calls. Maybe we could talk about your situation this weekend?" My situation. Like my marriage imploding was a minor inconvenience compared to Jessica's third trip down the aisle. I looked at Dad, hoping he'd step in, be the voice of reason he'd always been when Jessica and I fought as kids. He was examining his coffee mug like it held the secrets of the universe. "The thing is, Sarah," he finally said, not meeting my eyes, "Jessica's wedding is in 3 months. We've already put down deposits, made commitments. Your divorce, well, that's going to take time anyway. There's no rush to hash it all out tonight." No rush? I was living with a cheating husband, my kids were asking why Daddy seemed so angry all the time, and there was no rush. Meanwhile, Jessica was planning her third wedding to Brad Davis, a real estate developer who'd swept her off her feet 6 months after her second divorce was finalized. Her second divorce that my parents had also helped pay for, I might add. I should have seen the pattern then, but I was too hurt, too desperate for my parents' support to think clearly. Jessica had always been the golden child, the one who could do no wrong even when she was doing everything wrong. When she dropped out of college to marry Kevin Walsh at 19, my parents called it true love and paid for a $15,000 wedding. When that marriage crashed after 18 months because Jessica got bored, they helped her with the divorce lawyer fees and a security deposit on a new apartment. Then came Danny Rodriguez, the personal trainer she met at the gym 6 months later. Another whirlwind romance. Another expensive wedding. This time $25,000 because Jessica deserved the fairy tale she missed the first time.
That marriage lasted 2 years before Jessica decided Danny wasn't ambitious enough for her tastes. Again, my parents swooped in with financial support and emotional validation. Now, here was Brad Davis, husband number 3. And instead of questioning Jessica's pattern, my parents were planning to spend $45,000 on her third wedding reception at the Westfield Country Club, the most expensive venue in Springfield because, as Jessica put it, she'd learned from her mistakes and this time she was marrying the right kind of man. The right kind of man apparently meant rich enough to keep Jessica in the lifestyle she felt she deserved. Brad owned 3 successful real estate offices around Springfield and drove a BMW that cost more than I made in a year teaching elementary school. He wore expensive suits and took Jessica to Chicago for weekend shopping trips. Most importantly, he didn't question Jessica's spending habits or her need to be the center of attention at all times. But that night, sitting in my childhood kitchen while my marriage crumbled, I wasn't thinking about Jessica's track record or my parents' obvious favoritism. I was thinking about my kids, about how I was going to afford a lawyer, about whether I could keep our house on my teacher's salary. I was thinking about starting over at 35 with 2 kids and no financial safety net. I tried one more time to get through to them. Mom, I need help. I don't know how I'm going to handle this divorce, the custody battle, keeping Emma and Lucas stable through all this chaos. Mark's already talking about fighting me for joint custody, and you know how that goes. The parent with more money usually wins. My mother sighed, the kind of exasperated sound she used to make when Jessica and I interrupted her soap operas. Sarah, you're a smart woman. You'll figure it out. Teachers have
Good job security, and there are programs to help single mothers. Jessica's situation is more complicated because of the business aspects. Jessica worked part-time as a marketing coordinator for a small firm downtown, making maybe $30,000 a year when she felt like showing up consistently. The only business aspect was that Brad wanted her to quit working altogether after they got married so she could focus on being a wife and maybe starting a family. My parents thought this was romantic. I thought it was Jessica setting herself up for another divorce when she got bored playing house. That's when Jessica looked up from her wedding magazines with that saccharine smile she'd perfected over the years. Sarah, I know this is hard for you, but some of us are actually building something lasting. Brad and I have been together 8 months, and we're talking about kids, about building a real future. Maybe if you hadn't been so focused on your career, Mark wouldn't have strayed. The room went dead silent. Even my parents looked uncomfortable with that particular dig. I felt heat rise in my chest, the kind of anger that starts as hurt and transforms into something much more dangerous. Jessica had just blamed me for my husband's infidelity because I chose to keep working as a teacher instead of being a housewife. I stood up slowly, my chair scraping against the kitchen floor. You know what, Jessica? You're right. I was focused on my career. I was focused on supporting my family, on being a good role model for my kids, on contributing something meaningful to the world instead of just looking for the next man to take care of me. And you're
Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story.
absolutely right about building something lasting. Your longest marriage was 2 years. Congratulations on that impressive track record. Sarah, that's enough, my father said, finally finding his voice. Jessica's trying to get her life together, and we're not going to let family drama derail this wedding. Family drama? My marriage falling apart was family drama? But Jessica's third wedding was a sacred event that couldn't be disrupted? I looked around that kitchen one more time, at the family photos covering the refrigerator, most of them featuring Jessica's various weddings and engagement parties. There were pictures of me at college graduation, teaching awards from the school district, Emma and Lucas at their school events, but they seemed faded next to Jessica's glamorous moments. Fine, I said, grabbing my purse. I'll figure it out myself. But don't expect me to pretend to be happy about Jessica's fairy tale when my real life is falling apart and you can't be bothered to care. I walked out of that house knowing something fundamental had shifted in my family dynamic, but I had no idea how much worse it would get.
Over the next several weeks, while I struggled to find a divorce lawyer I could afford, while I worked extra tutoring sessions to pay for legal consultations, while I tried to explain to Emma and Lucas why Daddy was moving to an apartment, my parents were busy with wedding preparations. Every conversation with them somehow circled back to Jessica's needs. They couldn't help me move Mark's belongings out because they were meeting with the florist. They couldn't watch the kids while I met with lawyers because they had a tasting at the country club. They couldn't loan me money for legal fees because they had already committed their savings to the wedding expenses. The worst part was how they made me feel guilty for even asking. When I mentioned that my lawyer wanted a $5,000 retainer that I didn't have, my mother suggested I put it on a credit card. When I explained that my credit was maxed out from covering household expenses while Mark contributed nothing, she wondered aloud why I hadn't been more financially responsible over the years. Meanwhile, Jessica was posting daily updates on social media about wedding dress shopping, venue decorating, and honeymoon planning. She tagged my parents in every post, thanking them for their generous support and unconditional love. The comments were full of congratulations and heart emojis, everyone celebrating Jessica's happiness while my life disintegrated in private. The breaking point came 6 weeks before Jessica's wedding. Emma came home from school crying because some kids in her class had been teasing her about her parents' divorce. Lucas had been acting out, getting in trouble for pushing other students and refusing to do his homework. I was barely holding myself together, working extra hours to pay bills, meeting with lawyers during my lunch breaks, and trying to maintain some sense of normalcy for my children. I called my parents that evening, hoping maybe the wedding stress had died down enough for them to remember they had another daughter who needed support. My mother answered, and I could hear music and laughter in the background. "Mom," I said, trying to keep my voice steady, "I really need to talk to you and Dad. Emma's having a hard time at school and Lucas is acting out. I think they need some stability, maybe some time with their grandparents who love them. Could they stay with you this weekend while I catch up on work and legal paperwork?" There was a pause, then that familiar sigh. "Oh, honey, this weekend is Jessica's bridal shower. We've got 30 people coming and I've been preparing for weeks. Maybe next weekend?" Next weekend was the wedding rehearsal. The weekend after that was the wedding itself. I was beginning to understand that in my parents' minds, there would never be a good time to help me, because Jessica's needs would always take priority. But I tried one more approach. "Mom, my kids are your grandchildren. They're scared and confused, and they need their family right now. Jessica's bridal shower will go on just fine without Emma and Lucas there. They need you more than Jessica needs perfect party decorations." "Sarah, you're being dramatic," my mother replied, her voice taking on that cold edge I remembered from childhood when she was about to end a conversation. "Emma and Lucas will be fine. Children are resilient. Jessica only gets married once, and we want this day to be perfect for her." Only gets married once? This was Jessica's third marriage, but apparently my parents had developed selective amnesia about the previous two disasters. I hung up without saying goodbye, something I'd never done before in my life, but I was too angry and hurt to manage pleasantries. That night, after putting the kids to bed, I sat at my kitchen table with a glass of wine and really looked at my situation. My husband had cheated and was fighting me for custody while contributing nothing to our children's care. My parents had essentially disowned me in favor of funding Jessica's latest romantic adventure. My savings were depleted from legal fees, and I was working myself into the ground trying to keep our household afloat. But I wasn't going to give up, and I certainly wasn't going to let my parents rewrite history to
Make Jessica look like the victim and me look like the troublemaker. I had been the responsible daughter, the one who worked hard, paid her bills, raised her children with values and integrity. If my family couldn't see that, I'd find a way to make them see it. I opened my laptop and started documenting everything. Every conversation where my parents had chosen Jessica's wedding over my crisis, every time they'd made me feel guilty for needing help while pouring money into Jessica's fantasy, every detail of Jessica's previous marriages and divorces that they seemed determined to forget. I was building a case, not for court, but for the inevitable confrontation that was coming.
because I knew Jessica well enough to know that this marriage would end like the others, and when it did, my parents would expect me to forgive and forget their abandonment. They'd expect me to welcome Jessica back into the family fold and pretend nothing had happened. But this time was different. This time, I had been keeping track, and I was ready to demand some accountability. What I didn't know yet was that Jessica's pattern of using people and discarding them extended far beyond her romantic relationships. I was about to discover that my sister had been manipulating our parents for years, and the upcoming wedding was just the latest chapter in a much larger scheme. The truth would come out in the most unexpected way during what was supposed to be Jessica's perfect day, and it would change our family forever. Part 2, 5. The stakes rise and betrayal deepens. What I discovered 3 days after that devastating phone call changed everything I thought I knew about my family. I was grading papers at my kitchen table when my phone buzzed with a text from my friend Amanda Chen, who worked as a secretary at the Hamilton County Clerk's office. The message was simple but earth-shattering. "Sarah, you need to see something. Can you meet me at Murphy's Diner after work tomorrow?" Amanda had been my closest friend since we started teaching at Lincoln Elementary 5 years ago. She was the kind of person who remembered your coffee order, always had tissues ready during parent conferences, and never gossiped unless it was absolutely necessary. So when she asked to meet with that serious tone, I knew it wasn't about lesson plans or faculty drama. The next afternoon, I slid into the cracked vinyl booth across from Amanda, my stomach already churning with anxiety. She had a manila folder in front of her, the kind used for official documents, and her usual cheerful demeanor was nowhere to be found. Without saying a word, she pushed the folder across the scratched formica table. "I need to tell you something about your parents and Jessica," she said quietly, glancing around to make sure no one was listening. "I wasn't supposed to see this, but when you work in the clerk's office, you process a lot of paperwork. Sometimes you notice patterns." I opened the folder with trembling fingers, not sure what I was about to discover. The first document was a business license amendment for Mitchell Gardens and Landscapes, dated just 2 months ago. My parents had added Jessica as a 50% owner of their landscaping company, the business they built from nothing over 30 years. The business worth over $150,000 that was supposed to be their retirement security. My blood went cold as I read the legal language. Jessica Mitchell Davis was now listed as co-owner with full rights to business decisions and profit distribution. But there was more. Amanda had copied additional documents showing a series of loans my parents had taken against the business over the past year, totaling nearly $60,000. The loan applications listed the funds as being used for family wedding expenses and business expansion. But I knew there hadn't been any business expansion. Our family's landscaping company had been running the same routes with the same equipment for years. Amanda leaned forward, her voice barely above a whisper. "Sarah, I've been watching this unfold for months. Your parents have been systematically liquidating their business assets to fund Jessica's lifestyle. The wedding is just the latest expense. I found records showing they paid for her apartment deposit when she left Danny, her car payments for 6 months, even her credit card debt from that shopping trip to Chicago with Brad." I stared at the documents, trying to process what this meant. My parents hadn't just chosen Jessica's wedding over my crisis, they'd essentially signed over their life's work to her. The business that was supposed to support them in their golden years, the legacy they'd built through decades of hard work, was being transferred to my sister, who'd never shown an ounce of interest in landscaping or business management. The implications hit me like a freight train. This wasn't about wedding favoritism or even Jessica being the golden child. This was about money, inheritance, and long-term financial planning. By making Jessica a co-owner of the business, my parents had effectively cut me out of any future inheritance while simultaneously funding her extravagant lifestyle. When they eventually retire or passed away, Jessica would own half of everything they'd worked for, and I'd get nothing except the knowledge that I'd been systematically excluded from my own family's financial future. But the folder contained even more disturbing revelations. Amanda had found divorce records from Jessica's previous marriages, and the pattern was more calculating than I had realized. In her divorce from Kevin Walsh,
Jessica had successfully claimed half of his small auto repair shop, even though they'd only been married 18 months and she'd never worked there. The settlement gave her $15,000, which she'd immediately spent on her apartment and wardrobe upgrade. Her divorce from Danny Rodriguez was even more telling. Despite Danny being a personal trainer with limited assets, Jessica had somehow walked away with his savings account, his motorcycle, and ongoing alimony payments for 2 years. She'd convinced the court that she'd sacrificed her career advancement to support his fitness training business, even though Danny worked at a franchise gym and had no business of his own. Now I understood Jessica's real pattern. She wasn't just someone who fell in and out of love easily. She was someone who used marriage as a financial advancement strategy. Each relationship was carefully chosen to improve her economic situation, and each divorce was strategically planned to maximize her settlement. Her upcoming marriage to Brad Davis wasn't about love or building a lasting partnership. It was about positioning herself for the biggest payoff yet. Brad owned 3 real estate offices and had assets worth over $500,000. If Jessica could stay married to him for a few years and establish herself as essential to his business success,
Divorce settlement could set her up for life. But even more concerning was how she'd convinced our parents to make her a business co-owner just months before marrying a wealthy man. If something happened to Brad's assets, or if their marriage didn't work out as planned, Jessica would still have her 50% stake in Mitchell Gardens and Landscapes as a backup plan. I looked up at Amanda, who was watching me process this information with obvious concern. "How long have you known about this?" she asked gently. "The business ownership change happened 2 months ago," she replied, "but I've been seeing the loan documents for almost a year. I kept hoping it was just temporary help, parents supporting a daughter through a rough patch. But when I saw the ownership transfer, I realized this was much bigger than wedding expenses." I felt sick to my stomach, not just because of the financial betrayal, but because of how completely I'd misunderstood the situation. I'd been begging my parents for help with basic legal fees and childcare support while they were quietly restructuring their entire financial legacy to benefit Jessica. I'd been made to feel guilty for asking for $5,000 to retain a divorce lawyer while they were transferring assets worth $75,000 to my sister without even telling me. The cruelest part was how they'd made me feel selfish and demanding for needing support during my divorce. Every conversation had been flavored with subtle implications that I should be more self-sufficient, more responsible with money, more capable of handling my problems without burdening them. Meanwhile, they were solving all of Jessica's problems before she even had to ask, setting her up for long-term financial security while leaving me to struggle alone. Amanda reached across the table and squeezed my hand. "I'm so sorry, Sarah. I debated whether to tell you, but I couldn't watch this happen to someone as good as you. You've always been there for everyone else, working extra hours to help struggling students, volunteering for every school committee, taking care of your kids with such dedication. You deserve better than this." I thanked Amanda and drove home in a fog, my mind reeling with questions and anger. How long had my parents been planning this? Did Jessica know about the business ownership change, or had she simply manipulated them so effectively that they'd made the decision on their own? How was I going to confront them about something I wasn't supposed to know? That evening, after Emma and Lucas were asleep, I spread Amanda's documents across my kitchen table and really studied the timeline. The first loan against the business had been taken out 13 months ago, right after Jessica announced her engagement to Brad. The subsequent loans had coincided with major wedding expenses, the venue deposit, the catering contract, Jessica's wedding dress shopping trip to New York City. But the most damaging document was the business ownership transfer, which had been filed just 6 weeks ago. The timing was particularly cruel because it was the same week I'd called my parents begging for help with Emma's counseling expenses. She'd been having nightmares and anxiety attacks related to the divorce, and I'd found a child psychologist who could help, but insurance only covered part of the cost. My parents had told me they didn't have extra money right then, suggesting I look into free counseling services through the school district.
While they were telling me they couldn't afford to help my traumatized daughter, they were signing legal documents giving Jessica ownership of assets worth $75,000. The hypocrisy was staggering, but even worse was the calculated nature of it. This wasn't about impulsive generosity or even obvious favoritism. This was about deliberate financial planning that specifically excluded me and my children from any future security. I realized I needed to understand more about Jessica's influence over our parents, so I started thinking back over the past few years with fresh eyes. I remembered how Jessica had started visiting them more frequently after her second divorce, bringing expensive wine and gourmet dinners, spending entire weekends helping with household projects and garden planning. At the time, I'd been impressed by her newfound maturity and family commitment. Now I understood it as a calculated campaign to position herself as the devoted daughter who deserved special consideration. She'd also become their primary source of social media presence, constantly posting photos of family dinners and holiday celebrations, always making sure to tag local businesses and friends. My parents, who'd never been comfortable with technology, suddenly had an active online presence showcasing their successful landscaping work and happy family life. Jessica had made herself indispensable as their connection to the modern world, their bridge to younger customers and contemporary business practices. Meanwhile, I'd been the reliable daughter in the background, showing up for birthday dinners and holiday gatherings, but never making a big production of it. I'd never posted elaborate social media tributes or brought expensive gifts. I'd simply been present, consistent, and supportive in quiet ways that apparently didn't register as valuable compared to Jessica's flashy demonstrations of attention. The more I analyzed the situation, the angrier I became. But it was a cold, calculated anger rather than the hot, emotional rage I'd felt initially. I was beginning to see the full scope of Jessica's manipulation and my parents' willingness to be manipulated. This wasn't just about wedding favoritism. This was about a systematic campaign to restructure our family's financial future in Jessica's favor. I spent the next several days researching business law and inheritance planning, trying to understand my options. What I discovered was both encouraging and terrifying. As my parents' other child, I had legal rights to challenge business transfers that appeared to be fraudulent or made under undue influence. If I could prove that Jessica had manipulated them into making financial decisions that weren't in their best interest, I might be able to reverse some of the damage. But pursuing legal action against my own parents would mean destroying any remaining family relationships and potentially bankrupting them with legal fees. It would also mean exposing Jessica's pattern of manipulation in a very public way, which might feel satisfying in the moment, but would have long-lasting consequences for everyone involved. As I wrestled with these options, I kept coming back to one central question. What did I really want from this situation? Did I want financial compensation, family reconciliation, or simply the satisfaction of exposing the truth? The answer wasn't clear, but I knew I couldn't continue pretending everything was normal while my family systematically excluded me from any future security.
Their future plans. 2 weeks before Jessica's wedding, I made a decision that would change everything. I was going to attend the wedding, smile through the ceremony and reception, and wait for the perfect moment to reveal what I knew about the business transfers and Jessica's marital history. Not to cause a scene or ruin her day, but to ensure that our parents finally understood the true cost of their favoritism and the real nature of Jessica's character. I spent those 2 weeks gathering additional evidence, contacting Jessica's ex-husbands, and documenting every instance of my parents' financial support for her over the years. I wasn't planning to destroy Jessica's marriage or humiliate my parents publicly, but I was determined to have an honest conversation about family loyalty, financial responsibility, and the consequences of choosing one child over another. What I didn't anticipate was that Jessica had her own surprises planned for the wedding day, and that my revelation about the business transfers would pale in comparison to what she was really planning to do to our family. The truth about her relationship with Brad Davis and her long-term financial strategy was far more complex and devastating than even I had imagined. The wedding was scheduled for Saturday, November 16th at the Westfield Country Club, with a reception to follow in their grand ballroom. 150 guests had been invited, including extended family, Brad's business associates, and half the Springfield social scene. My parents had spared no expense, hiring a live band, professional photographer, and catering service that specialized in upscale events. As the date approached, I found myself caught between anticipation and dread. Part of me was eager to finally confront the lies and manipulation that had poisoned our family relationships. But another part of me mourned the loss of innocence, the end of whatever genuine love and connection we'd once shared. After that wedding day, nothing would ever be the same between us, and I wasn't sure if that would be a liberation or another kind of loss. The night before the wedding, I tucked Emma and Lucas into bed and sat in my quiet living room, thinking about the choice I was about to make. Tomorrow, I would either find a way to rebuild my family relationships on a foundation of honesty and mutual respect, or I would burn those bridges forever in pursuit of justice and truth. Either way, I was done being the invisible daughter, the one who suffered in silence while Jessica got everything she wanted at everyone else's expense. I fell asleep at night with Amanda's folder of documents on my nightstand, ready to change my family's story forever. Parts 6 to 9, Preparing for Battle and Hidden Truths. The call came at 7:30 on a Thursday morning, 3 days before Jessica's wedding, while I was making breakfast for Emma and Lucas before school. The number wasn't one I recognized, but something made me answer despite my usual policy of letting unknown calls go to voicemail during the morning rush. The voice on the other end was hesitant, almost nervous. "Is this Sarah Mitchell? This is Kevin Walsh. I used to be married to your sister Jessica." I nearly dropped the phone. Kevin Walsh was Jessica's first husband, the one she'd married at 19 and what my parents had called a beautiful love story. I hadn't spoken to him since their divorce 7 years ago, and I certainly hadn't expected to hear from him 3 days before Jessica's third wedding. "I know this is weird," Kevin continued, "and I'm sorry to bother you, but I heard through some mutual friends that Jessica's getting married again this weekend. There are some things you need to know about your sister, things that might be important for your family to understand before they get in any deeper with her schemes." I stepped into the hallway, away from the kids, my heart racing. "Kevin," I whispered, "what are you talking about? What schemes?" There was a long pause, then a heavy sigh. "Sarah, Jessica didn't leave me because we grew apart or because she was too young to be married. She left me because she'd been planning our divorce from almost the beginning, setting herself up to take half of everything I owned. She documented every penny I spent on her, every gift I gave her, every time I paid for dinner or groceries. She was building a case to prove she'd become financially dependent on me so she could claim spousal support." My blood went cold. I thought about the business ownership documents Amanda had shown me, the careful way Jessica had positioned herself with our parents over the past year. If Kevin was telling the truth, Jessica's manipulation went much deeper than I had realized. Kevin continued talking, his voice gaining strength as if he'd been waiting years to tell someone the story. "She had a whole filing system, Sarah. Bank statements, receipts, photographs of gifts I'd given her. She even recorded some of our conversations without me knowing. Conversations where I talked about my business plans and financial goals. When we went to court, her lawyer had documentation going back to our 3rd month of marriage." I sank into the hallway chair, trying to process this information. "How did you find out about the documentation she'd been keeping?" Kevin's laugh was bitter. "I found it by accident 2 weeks before she filed for divorce. She'd left a folder open on our kitchen table, and I saw my bank statements with highlighted sections and notes in her handwriting. Notes about my spending patterns, my business expenses, even my plans to expand the auto shop. When I confronted her about it, she didn't even deny it. She just looked at me with this cold expression and said she was protecting her future." The pieces were starting to form a terrifying picture. Jessica hadn't just been the impulsive romantic I had always thought she was. She'd been a calculating predator who used marriage as a business strategy. Each relationship had been carefully planned and executed for maximum financial gain, and each divorce had been orchestrated to leave her in a better position than before. "Kevin," I said quietly, "why are you telling me this now? What do you want, Libidu?" He was quiet for a moment, then spoke with obvious emotion in his voice. "Because I heard she's marrying some wealthy real estate guy, and I heard your parents are helping fund this wedding after they helped her with the previous ones. Someone in your family needs to understand what she really is before she destroys more lives. And honestly, Sarah, I always liked you. You were kind to me when Jessica and I were married, and you didn't deserve to watch her manipulate your whole family without knowing the truth." I thanked Kevin and promised to think about what he'd told me, but inside I was already formulating a plan. If Jessica had documentation systems for her previous marriages, she definitely had one for Brad Davis. More importantly, if she was following the same pattern with our parents' business, there might be evidence of that manipulation as well. After dropping Emma and Lucas at school, I drove straight to the Springfield Public Library and spent 2 hours researching Jessica's divorce records online. What I found made my stomach turn. In both of her previous divorces, Jessica had filed identical claims about sacrificing her career advancement to support her husband's business interests. The language was almost word for word the same, as if she was following a template. More disturbing were the financial affidavits she'd filed, showing mysteriously high living expenses and claims of economic hardship that didn't match the lifestyle I'd observed her maintaining throughout both marriages. She'd claimed to need $3,000 a month for basic living expenses while living in apartments that cost $800 and driving cars with payments under $300. The pattern was clear and calculating. Jessica had turned marriage and divorce into a profitable business model, and she'd refined her approach with each iteration. By the time she married Danny Rodriguez, she'd perfected her documentation system and legal strategy. Now she was preparing to execute the same plan on Brad Davis, but with much higher stakes, given his substantial assets. But there was something else bothering me about Kevin's call. Something that made me think this wasn't just about warning the family. He'd mentioned hearing about Jessica's wedding through mutual friends, but Jessica had been very secretive about her guest list, claiming she wanted an intimate ceremony with only close family and Brad's business associates. How had Kevin learned about the wedding, and why had he waited until 3 days before to contact me? I decided to call Kevin back and ask him directly. When he answered, I didn't waste time with pleasantries. "Kevin, I've been thinking about our conversation this morning. How exactly did you find out about Jessica's wedding, and why are you really calling me now?" There was a long pause, then Kevin's voice became more serious. "Sarah, I need to tell you something else, but you have to promise me you won't let Jessica know where this information came from. My life has finally gotten back on track after what she put me through, and I can't afford to have her come after me again." I promised to protect his identity, and Kevin continued. "I didn't just hear about the wedding through friends. Danny Rodriguez called me 2 weeks ago, Jessica's second husband. He'd been contacted by a private investigator working for Brad Davis's business partner, someone who was concerned about Brad's sudden engagement to a woman with 2 previous divorces and unusual financial settlement patterns." My heart started racing. Brad Davis was being investigated? By his own business partner? Kevin explained that Brad's business partner, a man named Robert Chen, had become suspicious when Brad started talking about restructuring his business assets and adding Jessica to his corporate accounts just months after meeting her. Robert had hired a private investigator to look into Jessica's background, and the investigator had contacted both Kevin and Danny as part of his research. The investigator found the same patterns I'd just discovered online, but he'd also found something else. Jessica had been researching Brad's financial situation long before they met, using social media and public business records to identify him as a potential target. Their meeting at a charity fundraiser hadn't been the romantic coincidence Jessica had described to the family. It had been a carefully planned encounter. "Sarah," Kevin said, his voice urgent, "Jessica has been running the same con for years, but she's gotten much more sophisticated. The investigator thinks she's part of a larger network of women who target wealthy men for financial gain. They share information, strategies, even legal resources. Your sister isn't just a serial bride, she's a professional marriage fraud artist. I felt like the ground was shifting beneath me. Everything I thought I knew about Jessica, about her romantic history, about her relationship with our parents, was built on lies. She hadn't just been manipulating individual family members, she'd been executing a long-term criminal strategy that had now ensnared our entire family. The business ownership transfer suddenly made perfect sense. Jessica needed a backup plan in case her scheme with Brad Davis fell through, or if his business partner succeeded in exposing her before the wedding. By convincing our parents to make her co-owner of their landscaping business, she'd secured an alternate source of income and assets that couldn't be touched by any legal action related to her marriage fraud activities. But there was still one piece of the puzzle missing. If Robert Chen and his investigator had uncovered Jessica's pattern, why hadn't they stopped the wedding? Why was Brad Davis still planning to marry someone who was obviously targeting him for financial exploitation? Kevin answered that question before I could ask it. The investigator tried to present his findings to Brad, but Jessica had already poisoned that relationship. She'd convinced Brad that Robert was jealous of their happiness and trying to sabotage their marriage because he wanted to maintain control over the business. Brad fired Robert as his partner 2 weeks ago and is planning to buy out his share of the company right after the honeymoon. I realized I was witnessing something much more complex and dangerous than simple family favoritism. Jessica had orchestrated a sophisticated financial fraud that would leave multiple victims in its wake. Brad Davis, who would lose his business partner and potentially his assets, Robert Chen, who was being forced out of a successful business for trying to protect his friend, and my parents, who had unknowingly become accessories to Jessica's criminal activities by transferring business assets to her. The most chilling aspect was how perfectly Jessica had positioned herself. If her marriage to Brad succeeded, she'd eventually divorce him and take half of his substantial assets. If the marriage failed, or if Brad discovered her true nature, she'd still have her 50% ownership of Mitchell Gardens and Landscapes as a consolation prize. She'd created a no-lose situation for herself while putting everyone else at risk. I spent the rest of that day thinking about my options. I could try to warn Brad Davis directly, but Jessica had already proven she could turn him against anyone who questioned their relationship. I could confront my parents with the evidence of Jessica's fraud, but they were so emotionally and financially invested in the wedding that they might not believe me or might blame me for trying to destroy Jessica's happiness. The nuclear option would be to contact Robert Chen's investigator and offer to testify about the business ownership transfers and my parents' financial support for Jessica's previous divorces. That might be enough evidence to
build a legal case that could stop the wedding and expose Jessica's criminal activities. But it would also destroy my family relationships permanently and potentially result in my parents facing legal consequences for their unwitting participation in Jessica's schemes. That evening, I made a decision that surprised even me. I was going to attend Jessica's wedding as planned, but I was going to use the occasion to gather final evidence of her manipulation and give both Brad Davis and my parents one last chance to see the truth about her character. If they refused to listen or continued to enable her behavior, I would take everything I knew to the authorities and let the legal system sort out the consequences. I called Kevin back and asked if he would be willing to attend the wedding as my guest. I explained that I needed a witness to Jessica's behavior, someone who understood her manipulation tactics and could help me document anything suspicious that happened during the ceremony or reception. Kevin was hesitant at first, but when I explained that my parents had transferred business assets to Jessica and might face legal consequences if her fraud was exposed later, he agreed to help. The next morning, I called Amanda Chen and asked if she was related to Robert Chen, the business partner who'd been investigating Jessica. It turned out they were cousins, and Amanda had heard the whole story from Robert about his concerns regarding Brad Davis's sudden engagement. She offered to put me in touch with Robert directly, suggesting that we might be able to coordinate our efforts to protect both Brad and my parents from Jessica's scheme. Meeting Robert Chen was like looking into a mirror of my own frustration and helplessness. He was a successful businessman who'd watched his longtime friend and partner fall under the influence of someone he knew was dangerous, but he'd been unable to convince Brad to listen to reason. Like me, he'd been painted as jealous and manipulative for trying to protect someone he cared about from an obvious predator. Robert had spent weeks trying to find a way to expose Jessica without destroying his friendship with Brad, but Jessica had been too clever in turning Brad against him. Now Robert was facing the loss of his business partnership and a substantial financial investment because he'd tried to do the right thing. His situation was a preview of what might happen to me if my confrontation with Jessica went wrong. But Robert had something I didn't: concrete evidence of Jessica's research into Brad's financial situation before they met. His investigator had found social media posts and internet search records showing that Jessica had been studying Brad's business activities and personal life for months before their chance encounter at the charity fundraiser. She'd even researched the guest list for that event and chosen her outfit and conversation topics specifically to appeal to his interests. The evidence was damning, but it was also obtained through methods that might not be admissible in court or convincing to someone as emotionally invested as Brad had become. Jessica had been very careful to stay within legal boundaries while executing her manipulation, making it difficult to prove criminal intent rather than simply opportunistic behavior. As the wedding day approached, I found myself caught between hope and despair. Hope that somehow the truth would come out in a way that protected everyone I cared about, and despair that Jessica's manipulation had become too sophisticated and widespread to stop without causing collateral damage to innocent victims. The night before the wedding, I lay awake thinking about the little girl Jessica had once been, the sister who'd shared secrets with me and promised we'd always be family no matter what happened. Somewhere along the way, that little girl had been replaced by a calculating predator who saw other people as resources to be exploited rather than relationships to be cherished. I mourned the loss of my real sister, even as I prepared to confront the stranger she'd become. Tomorrow would bring answers to questions I'd been asking for months, but I suspected those answers would raise even more troubling questions about the nature of family, loyalty, and the price of enabling destructive behavior in the name of love. Part 10.14. The Wedding Day Reckoning. The morning of Jessica's wedding dawned gray and drizzly, which felt appropriate given what I knew was about to unfold. I dressed carefully in a navy blue dress that was elegant enough for the Westfield Country Club, but conservative enough to show respect for the occasion, even though I knew this day would end very differently than anyone expected. Emma and Lucas were staying with my neighbor, Mrs. Patterson, who'd agreed to watch them after I explained I might be dealing with family drama that wasn't appropriate for children to witness. Kevin Walsh picked me up at 10:30, looking nervous but determined in a dark suit I suspected he'd bought specifically for this occasion. He'd driven down from Akron the night before and stayed at a hotel near the country club, not wanting to risk running into Jessica or any of her friends around town. As we drove toward the venue, he filled me in on his conversation with Robert Chen the evening before. Robert had managed to get himself invited to the wedding reception through a mutual business contact, claiming he wanted to make peace with Brad before their partnership officially ended. He'd be watching Jessica's behavior from the business community perspective, while Kevin and I observed from the family side. We'd agreed to meet in the country club parking lot at 4 o'clock, right before the reception began, to compare notes and decide how to proceed. The ceremony was scheduled for 2 o'clock in the club's garden pavilion, with cocktails immediately following and dinner at 6. I deliberately arrived early, wanting to observe the setup and get a sense of Jessica's mood before the festivities began. What I saw when we walked into the country club lobby made my stomach clench with a mixture of anger and sadness.
My parents were standing near the registration table, both dressed in their finest clothes, beaming with pride as they greeted arriving guests. Dad wore the same navy suit he'd worn to my high school graduation, and Mom had on a pink dress I recognized from Easter services 2 years ago. They looked happy and excited, completely unaware that they were about to watch their investment in Jessica's future crumble in spectacular fashion. Jessica herself was in the bridal suite, surrounded by bridesmaids and a professional photographer who was documenting every moment of her preparation. Through the partially open door, I could see her in her wedding dress, a stunning creation that I later learned had cost $8,000.
Perfection. What struck me most was how genuine her happiness appeared. Either Jessica was an incredibly talented actress, or she'd actually convinced herself that this marriage was different from the others. Maybe she'd fallen for her own performance, or maybe she truly believed that Brad Davis was wealthy enough to satisfy her financial ambitions permanently. Either way, she seemed completely unaware that her carefully constructed world was about to collapse. Brad Davis looked exactly like the successful businessman Jessica had described. Tall, confident, expensively dressed, with the kind of easy charm that comes from years of closing real estate deals. He was circulating among the guests with practiced skill, making conversation with my parents' landscaping clients, Jessica's coworkers, and his own business associates. He seemed genuinely happy and completely devoted to Jessica, which made what was about to happen even more tragic. Kevin and I found seats toward the back of the ceremony space, close enough to observe everything, but far enough away to avoid drawing Jessica's attention. As the processional music began and Jessica walked down the aisle on my father's arm, I felt a wave of conflicting emotions. Part of me still hoped that somehow this marriage would be different, that Jessica had genuinely changed and found real love with Brad. But the rational part of my mind knew that was impossible given everything Kevin and Robert had uncovered about her systematic fraud patterns. The ceremony itself was beautiful and traditional, with Jessica and Brad exchanging vows they'd written themselves. Jessica's vows spoke about finding her soulmate after years of searching, about building a future based on trust and mutual support. Brad's vows talked about Jessica bringing joy and excitement into his previously routine life, about looking forward to growing old together and building something lasting. Listening to those vows, knowing what I knew about Jessica's true motivations, was almost unbearable. Brad Davis was a decent man who genuinely believed he'd found the love of his life, while Jessica was executing a sophisticated financial fraud that would ultimately destroy him both emotionally and economically. The tragedy wasn't just that she was lying to him, it was that he was so completely convinced of her sincerity. During the cocktail hour, I watched Jessica work the room with calculating precision. She spent exactly the right amount of time with each group of guests, making sure to charm Brad's business associates while also maintaining warm relationships with my parents and their friends. She introduced Brad to people who might be useful for his real estate business, while subtly gathering information about the financial situations of various guests. Most disturbing was watching her interact with my parents. She was affectionate and grateful, thanking them repeatedly for their generous support, and talking about how excited she was to finally have the stability she'd always wanted. My parents glowed with pride, obviously feeling vindicated in their decision to invest so heavily in her happiness. They had no idea that Jessica was already planning her exit strategy from this marriage, just as she had with the previous two. At 4 o'clock, Kevin and I met Robert Chen in the parking lot as planned. Robert looked haggard and frustrated, clearly struggling with watching his longtime friend celebrate what he knew was a manipulative relationship. He'd spent the cocktail hour trying to engage Brad in casual conversation about business planning and asset protection, but Jessica had skillfully intercepted every attempt to have a private conversation. Robert had also observed something troubling during the cocktail hour. Jessica had been asking very specific questions about various guests' financial situations, business relationships, and investment strategies. She wasn't just collecting general social information, she was gathering intelligence that could be useful for future target selection.
Robert was convinced that Jessica was already planning her next victim even as she celebrated marrying her current one. We agreed that the reception dinner would be our best opportunity to reveal the truth about Jessica's background and motivations. Robert would approach Brad during the father-daughter dance when Jessica would be occupied and unable to interfere. Meanwhile, Kevin and I would present the evidence to my parents, hoping to make them understand how they'd been manipulated before the situation got any worse. The reception began with all the traditional elements: the grand entrance of the bride and groom, the first dance, speeches from the wedding party. Brad's best man gave a heartfelt toast about his friend finally finding happiness after years of focusing solely on business success. Jessica's maid of honor, a college friend I barely knew, spoke about Jessica's resilience and her ability to overcome past disappointments to find true love. Every speech felt like a knife twist, knowing the happiness being celebrated was built on deception and manipulation. I watched my parents during the toasts, seeing their obvious pride and joy in Jessica's apparent success. They truly believed they'd helped their daughter find the security and love she deserved, and learning the truth would devastate them almost as much as it would destroy Brad. When the father-daughter dance began, I saw Robert Chen approach Brad's table and engage him in what appeared to be a serious conversation. Brad's expression gradually shifted from polite attention to confusion and then to obvious distress. I could see Robert showing him documents on his phone, probably the evidence his investigator had gathered about Jessica's previous marriages and research into Brad's financial situation. Meanwhile, Kevin and I approached my parents' table, where they were sitting with some of their longtime landscaping clients and looking completely content with how the evening was progressing. I asked if we could speak privately, and we moved to a quiet corner of the reception hall where I could present what I'd discovered about Jessica's manipulation of their business assets and her history of marriage fraud. My mother's first reaction was complete denial. She insisted that I was jealous of Jessica's happiness and trying to ruin her special day out of spite. My father was more thoughtful, asking specific questions about the business ownership documents and the timeline of Jessica's financial requests. When Kevin began explaining Jessica's pattern of behavior during their marriage, including her documentation system and strategic divorce planning, my father's expression grew increasingly grim. The confrontation with my parents was interrupted by a commotion near the dance floor. Brad Davis had apparently confronted Jessica about Robert's revelations, and their argument was becoming loud enough to attract attention from other guests. Jessica was using her usual plausible deniability strategies, denying any wrongdoing and claiming Robert was jealous of her newfound happiness.
Tactics, accusing Brad of being paranoid and jealous, claiming that Robert was trying to destroy their marriage because he couldn't stand seeing Brad happy. But Brad had seen too much evidence to be easily manipulated. He was demanding explanations for Jessica's research into his financial situation before they met, her conversations with his business rivals, and her sudden interest in restructuring his corporate assets. Jessica's carefully maintained facade was beginning to crack under the pressure of having her deceptions exposed in such a public setting. The situation escalated quickly when Jessica, realizing that her usual manipulation tactics weren't working, made a desperate attempt to turn the wedding guests against Brad. She began crying and claiming that Brad was having second thoughts about their marriage because of pressure from his business associates who didn't think she was good enough for him. She appealed to my parents for support, begging them to help her convince Brad that their love was real. That's when I made my decision to reveal everything I knew. I approached the microphone that had been used for the wedding toasts and asked for everyone's attention. The reception hall gradually fell silent as guests realized something significant was happening beyond normal wedding drama. I began by explaining my relationship to Jessica and my initial support for her marriage to Brad. Then I detailed what I'd discovered about her systematic manipulation of our parents' business assets, her pattern of strategic marriages and divorces, and the evidence Kevin and Robert had gathered about her research into Brad's financial situation. I presented copies of the business ownership documents, divorce settlement records from her previous divorces, and Kevin's testimony about her documentation system and divorce planning. The reaction from the wedding guests was immediate and dramatic. Some people began leaving immediately, clearly uncomfortable with the family drama unfolding before them.
Others stayed to hear the full story, obviously fascinated by the revelation that they'd been attending what was essentially a fraud in progress rather than a genuine celebration of love. Jessica's response was to attack my credibility and motivations, claiming that I was bitter about my own failed marriage and jealous of her success in finding love and financial security. She accused me of coordinating with disgruntled ex-husbands and rejected business partners to destroy her happiness. For a few minutes, it seemed like her manipulation skills might still be effective enough to convince some guests that I was the villain in this situation. But then my father did something that surprised everyone, including me. He stood up and asked Jessica directly about the business ownership documents and the timeline of her financial requests. When Jessica tried to deflect and change the subject, my father pressed for specific answers about her plans for the landscaping business and her understanding of the legal implications of the ownership transfer. Under direct questioning from my father, with the entire wedding reception watching, Jessica's facade finally crumbled completely. She admitted that she'd researched Brad's financial situation before they met, that she'd encouraged my parents to make her a business co-owner as security for her future, and that she'd learned from her previous divorces how to protect herself financially in case this marriage didn't work out. The admission was devastating, not just because it confirmed everything we'd revealed, but because Jessica seemed almost relieved to finally stop pretending. She'd been maintaining so many lies and manipulating so many people that telling the truth, even in such a destructive context, appeared to be a release for her. Brad Davis's reaction was heartbreaking to witness. The man who'd been glowing with happiness just hours earlier looked completely shattered as he realized that everything he'd believed about his relationship with Jessica had been a carefully constructed deception. He quietly removed his wedding ring and placed it on the head table, then walked out of the reception without saying another word. The aftermath of the revelation was chaotic and painful for everyone involved. Most of the wedding guests left immediately, many of them demanding refunds from vendors or explanations about what they'd just witnessed. My parents were devastated, not just by learning about Jessica's manipulation, but by realizing how they'd been used to facilitate her fraud against an innocent man. Jessica herself seemed to go through several emotional stages in quick succession: anger at being exposed, attempts to minimize the damage by claiming her feelings for Brad were genuine, even if her methods were questionable, and finally a kind of cold resignation as she realized that her carefully planned future had been destroyed. In the days following the wedding disaster, the legal and financial consequences began to unfold. Brad Davis initiated an annulment proceeding and demanded the return of all gifts and financial commitments he'd made to Jessica. My parents worked with their lawyer to reverse the business ownership transfer, though the process would take months and cost thousands in legal fees they couldn't afford. Jessica's response to the collapse of her plans was to disappear from Springfield entirely. She moved out of the townhouse she'd shared with Brad, quit her job at the marketing firm, and left town without telling anyone where she was going. Some family friends reported seeing her in Columbus a few weeks later, but she made no attempt to contact our parents or explain her actions. The impact on my parents was profound and lasting. They aged visibly in the weeks following the wedding, struggling with guilt over their role in Jessica's fraud and shame about how completely they'd been manipulated. They were also facing serious financial difficulties due to the loans they'd taken against their business to fund Jessica's lifestyle and wedding expenses. For me, the revelation brought a mixture of vindication and sorrow. I'd been proven right about Jessica's manipulation and my parents' favoritism, but the cost had been the complete destruction of our family relationships. My parents were too embarrassed and hurt to maintain normal contact with me, and Jessica was gone entirely, leaving behind only the wreckage of her schemes. The most positive outcome was the relationship I developed with Emma and Lucas's understanding of family loyalty and personal integrity. They'd been old enough to understand some of what had happened, and we had many conversations about the difference between genuine love and manipulative behavior, between supporting family members and enabling destructive choices. 6 months after the wedding disaster, I received a letter from Jessica postmarked from Phoenix, Arizona. She didn't apologize for her actions or attempt to justify her behavior. Instead, she simply explained that she realized she couldn't
continue living the way she had been, constantly manipulating people and planning her next scheme. She was working as a waitress and living in a studio apartment, trying to figure out how to build a life based on her own efforts rather than other people's resources. The letter didn't repair our relationship or undo the damage she'd caused, but it did suggest that the confrontation at her wedding had forced her to face some uncomfortable truths about herself. Whether that self-awareness would lead to genuine change remained to be seen, but it was at least a starting point for redemption. My parents and I eventually rebuilt our relationship, though it took nearly a year of difficult conversations and family counseling to work through the hurt and betrayal on both sides. They came to understand how their favoritism had affected me and how their financial support had enabled Jessica's destructive behavior. I learned to forgive their mistakes while still maintaining healthy boundaries about future family dynamics. The most important lesson from the entire experience was understanding the difference between loving someone and enabling their harmful behavior. My parents had thought they were supporting Jessica's happiness, but they'd actually been facilitating her exploitation of others. I'd thought I was being a good sister by keeping quiet about my concerns, but my silence had allowed Jessica's manipulation to continue unchecked. Looking back now, I realize that confronting Jessica at her wedding was both the most difficult and most necessary thing I'd ever done. It destroyed our family's comfortable illusions, but forced all of us to face the truth about our relationships and our responsibilities to each other. Sometimes love requires difficult honesty rather than comfortable lies, even when that honesty comes at a significant personal cost. The experience also taught me about the importance of documenting and reporting suspected fraud, even when it involves family members. If I'd spoken up sooner about Jessica's pattern of behavior, Brad Davis might have been spared the emotional and financial devastation of believing he'd found true love when he'd actually become the target of a sophisticated scam. Today, Emma and Lucas are thriving despite the family drama they witnessed, and they've learned valuable lessons about integrity, honesty, and the importance of treating relationships as connections between people, rather than opportunities for personal gain. My divorce was finalized 6 months after Jessica's wedding disaster, and while it was painful, I was able to maintain custody of my children and keep our house thanks to the legal fees I could finally afford once my parents stopped diverting their resources to Jessica's schemes. The most satisfying outcome was learning that Brad Davis had successfully rebuilt his business partnership with Robert Chen, and that their company was thriving without the complications Jessica would have brought to it. Sometimes protecting people from manipulation requires dramatic action, but the long-term benefits of truth and honesty always outweigh the short-term pain of difficult revelations. 2 years have passed since that devastating wedding day at the Westfield Country Club, and I'm sitting in my newly renovated kitchen watching Emma practice piano while Lucas works on a science project about solar systems. The house feels different now, warmer somehow, despite all the changes we've weathered as a family. The morning sun streams through windows I was finally able to replace last spring, and there's a sense of peace here that I didn't think was possible during those dark months of my divorce and family crisis. The legal aftermath of Jessica's wedding disaster took nearly 18 months to fully resolve. Brad Davis pursued his annulment with determination, and his lawyers successfully recovered most of the assets Jessica had attempted to claim during their brief marriage. The prenuptial agreement they'd signed, which Jessica had tried to challenge, held up in court thanks to the evidence Robert Chen's investigator had gathered about her premeditation and research into Brad's financial situation before they met. My parents' situation was more complicated and painful to navigate. Reversing the business ownership transfer required extensive legal documentation and cost them nearly $12,000 in attorney fees, money they didn't have after funding Jessica's expensive lifestyle and wedding. They were forced to take out additional loans against Mitchell Gardens and Landscapes, essentially mortgaging their retirement to undo the damage Jessica had caused to their financial stability. The emotional toll on my parents was perhaps even greater than the financial cost. Dad developed what his doctor called stress-related heart palpitations, and Mom went through a period of depression that required counseling and medication. They'd spent 30 years building their landscaping business from nothing,
creating a legacy they'd planned to pass down to their children. And Jessica had nearly destroyed it all in less than 2 years of systematic manipulation. But there were also unexpected positive developments that emerged from the crisis. The publicity around Jessica's wedding disaster, while initially embarrassing for my parents, actually brought them new business from community members who admired their integrity in reversing the ownership transfer and taking responsibility for their unwitting role in Jessica's schemes. People respected that they'd chosen to do the right thing, even when it cost them financially. And several major commercial landscaping contracts came their way as a result. More importantly, the experience forced my parents and I to have conversations we'd been avoiding for years about favoritism, family dynamics, and the difference between supporting a child and enabling destructive behavior. We attended family counseling sessions together, something I never thought they'd agree to, and slowly began rebuilding our relationship on a more honest and balanced foundation. The process wasn't easy or quick. There were heated arguments about past decisions, painful admissions about hurt feelings and resentment, and many tears as we worked through decades of accumulated misunderstandings and poor communication. But gradually, we developed a new way of relating to each other that was based on mutual respect rather than the old patterns of favoritism and manipulation that had allowed Jessica to exploit our family relationships. My parents now have a much more active and meaningful relationship with Emma and Lucas, one that isn't overshadowed by competing demands from Jessica or filtered through my hurt feelings about being treated as a second priority. They attend school events, help with homework, and have even started teaching the kids about landscaping and gardening, sharing their knowledge and passion in a way that makes both of them brighter and happier.
Ways they never did when they were distracted by Jessica's constant crises and demands. Emma, now 12, has become fascinated with plant biology and is considering a career in environmental science, partly inspired by her grandparents' work and expertise. Lucas, at 10, shows more interest in the business aspects of the landscaping company and has started creating detailed drawings of garden designs that my father takes seriously enough to discuss with him as potential future projects. The divorce from Mark was finalized 8 months after Jessica's wedding, and while it was emotionally difficult, the financial settlement was more favorable than I'd initially expected. Mark's guilt about his infidelity, combined with his desire to avoid a prolonged custody battle, led him to agree to terms that allowed me to keep the house and receive adequate child support for Emma and Lucas's needs. Mark has remarried his former secretary, a development that initially hurt more than I'd anticipated, but ultimately provided closure about the end of our relationship. His new wife is kind to Emma and Lucas during their bi-weekly visits, and while the situation is still awkward sometimes, we've managed to create a co-parenting arrangement that prioritizes our children's well-being over our adult resentments and disappointments. My teaching career has flourished in ways I hadn't expected. The stress of the divorce and family crisis initially made it difficult to focus on my classroom responsibilities, but once the immediate chaos settled, I found that my experiences had given me new insights into helping students who were dealing with family difficulties or personal challenges. The school principal noticed my improved ability to connect with struggling students and nominated me for a district-wide Teaching Excellence Award that I received last spring. The recognition led to opportunities to mentor new teachers and participate in curriculum development projects that have reignited my passion for education. I'm currently pursuing a master's degree in educational leadership through an online program with the long-term goal of moving into school administration, where I can have a broader impact on students' lives and educational experiences. As for Jessica, the information we receive about her life comes sporadically and through indirect sources. She remained in Phoenix for about a year after the wedding disaster, working various service industry jobs and apparently living a much more modest lifestyle than she'd become accustomed to during her married years. Friends who'd stayed in touch with her reported that she seemed genuinely committed to supporting herself through her own work, rather than seeking another wealthy partner to exploit.
However, old patterns proved difficult to break entirely. About 6 months ago, my parents received word through a mutual acquaintance that Jessica had married a divorced businessman in Arizona, someone she'd met at the restaurant where she was working as a server. The marriage happened quickly and quietly, without any fanfare or family involvement, leading us to wonder whether Jessica had simply refined her approach rather than abandoned it entirely. There's been no direct contact between Jessica and our family since her letter from Phoenix 2 years ago. My parents struggled with whether to reach out when they learned about her new marriage, but ultimately decided to maintain the boundaries we'd established after the wedding disaster. They sent a brief congratulatory card with no return address, but haven't received any response or acknowledgement. The absence of Jessica from our family life has been both liberating and melancholy. Family gatherings are much more peaceful and genuine without the undercurrent of manipulation and drama that always accompanied her presence. But there's also a persistent sadness about losing someone who was once such an important part of our lives. Emma and Lucas occasionally ask about their aunt, and I try to explain the situation in age-appropriate ways that don't demonize Jessica, but also don't minimize the harm her choices caused to people who loved her. The most profound change in my life has been learning to trust my own judgment and speak up when I observe concerning behavior or patterns. During Jessica's years of manipulation, I often sensed that something wasn't right, but dismissed my concerns as jealousy or overanalysis. Now I understand that those instincts were usually accurate, and I've become much better at addressing problems directly, rather than hoping they'll resolve themselves or that someone else will handle the difficult conversations. This new assertiveness has improved all my relationships, from my interactions with Emma and Lucas's teachers, to my collaboration with colleagues at school, to my negotiations with Mark about co-parenting issues. I've learned that avoiding conflict often creates bigger problems than addressing issues honestly and promptly, even when those conversations are uncomfortable or emotionally challenging.
Courage and assertiveness I didn't know I possessed. The experience also taught me valuable lessons about recognizing and responding to manipulation in all its forms. Jessica's techniques, the emotional appeals, the guilt-inducing comparisons, the strategic use of crisis and celebration to control family attention and resources are unfortunately common in many family systems and workplace environments. Understanding how these tactics work has made me better equipped to protect myself and my children from similar exploitation in the future. Perhaps most importantly, I've learned that genuine love sometimes requires saying no, setting boundaries, and refusing to enable destructive behavior even when doing so causes short-term pain or conflict. My parents thought they were expressing love for Jessica by constantly bailing her out of problems and funding her lifestyle choices. But their enabling actually prevented her from developing the skills and character necessary for healthy relationships and personal growth. The financial cost of Jessica's manipulation, the legal fees, the business loans, the wedding expenses, the lost assets, was significant and will continue to impact my parents' retirement plans for years to come. But the emotional and relational healing that emerged from finally confronting the truth has been invaluable for all of us who chose to do the difficult work of rebuilding our family connections on a foundation of honesty and mutual respect. Today, as I watch Emma and Lucas thriving in an environment free from the chaos and manipulation that characterized our family life during Jessica's most destructive period, I feel grateful for the strength that crisis gave me to fight for what was right. The wedding day confrontation was terrifying and painful, but it also marked the beginning of a more authentic and healthy way of living that has benefited everyone willing to embrace change and growth. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.